Hello and welcome to week 14 of Introduction to American Studies, our last reading of the semester. As a reminder, your final reflection will be due the following week, and I have posted the final assignment as well as a video with some guidance on Blackboard. And as always, please email me if you have any questions. A quick note about the reading itself. I cut 10 pages out of the middle between pages 282 and 292 because the chapter was kind of long and I decided you could get the gist without those 10 pages. But if you are really craving them, just let me know and I can send you the full chapter. I also just this week decided to cut off the last 5 pages, so you're only reading until page 302, not page 307, which is what it says in the syllabus. And I updated the file on Blackboard, so what's up there now is accurate. So I chose this reading because it takes the ideas of American nationalism and empire that we've been studying the past few weeks up to the present day, more or less, to consider the role of foreign policy in the Middle East in the 21st century on the idea of America and Americans. It's also an example of the interdisciplinary fields of cultural studies and media studies, which focus on the role of culture and media, particularly in social, political, and economic change. Other work that we have been reading has focused more on laws and policies and activism, but this chapter focuses on images, particularly photographs and televised images, and the power of images to produce ideas about America and Americans. And I really love how McAlister takes these iconic images and shows how race, class, gender, religion, and sexuality are all relevant to how these images portray America and the Middle East in particular ways that has served U.S. foreign policy interests. So McAlister's book covers the entire post-World War II era, but I'm having you read an excerpt of the last chapter, which focuses on 9/11. And she talks about 9/11 as being post-Cold War, and by that she means that it happened after the Cold War, which was the conflict between the US and the Soviet Union about the spread of communism. And so the Cold War basically ended with the breakup of the Soviet Union into Russia and various satellite nations in 1991. And therefore, the nature of international politics after 1991 was reconfigured around other conflicts, notably centered less around Russia and more around the Middle East. So while during the Cold War the US government saw its primary adversary as communism, in the post-Cold War era, particularly after 9/11, McAlister argues that the US government saw its primary adversary as Islamic terrorism. And she analyzes 5 images to demonstrate how this new conflict was represented to the American public. And so you can see how she's really describing, in many cases, the foreign policy world that we're still currently living in. So the first image that she analyzes is the iconic image of firemen raising the flag over the rubble of the World Trade Center. And she basically argues that this image produced this idea of heroic masculinity, and particularly the masculinity of sort of white working class men as representatives of sort of America and Americanness. And that the flag itself then became an image of sort of nationalist revenge against Islamic terror, and as a sort of also interestingly used by Muslim and Arab Americans as a sort of defensive tactic, right, to articulate their own patriotism because there was so much racism and hate being spewed against Muslim and Arab Americans in the wake of 9/11. The second image that she analyzes is the sort of image and video of Osama bin Laden. And she argues that the way that this video was released to the American public, which was very different, she notes, than how it was released to people both in the Middle East and in Europe and other parts of the world, is that only certain parts of the video were released to the American public that furthered this idea of Islam as this sort of abstract evil religion and culture, completely divorced from the context of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, especially its support of the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories. And so while people in other parts of the world, right, would think of 9/11 in this longer context of kind of U.S. imperial power as it's been executed in the Middle East, right, Americans were encouraged to see it as this much more abstract sort of good versus evil conflict, and the image of Osama bin Laden as sort of the icon of that evil. The third image that she looks at is the image of Afghan women in burqas. And this I thought was a particularly interesting analysis. She talked about how American feminists, both white and black, sort of centered their own issues around personal and sexual freedom, including the burqa itself. So sort of freedom to wear what you want, freedom to present your body in public the way you want, as this sort of primary source of struggle. As opposed to the issues that most Afghan feminists or women were more concerned about, which were their sort of economic, political, and educational rights. Which is not to say that Afghan women, didn't have opinions about the burqa, but that wasn't necessarily the central issue for many of them. But it became kind of the central issue in the eye of the American public. And that the Bush administration sort of used this image of Afghan women in burqas to frame the war against terrorism as a war in defense of Muslim women, right? So that not only is this a war against the sort of abstract Islamic evil, but particularly, a patriarchal Islamic evil that, is oppressing women, which again is not to say that women were not oppressed under the Taliban. They certainly were in many ways, but by framing the war that way, right, again, it's another way to separate the war from U.S. foreign policy, practices and interests, and to create the idea of this sort of righteous war, right, in defense of and on behalf of, right, the people of the Middle East, which, many people in the Middle East would disagree with that characterization. And here is where note that those 10 pages I cut out, so it does sort of jump abruptly. And again, if you want those 10 pages, I can send them to you. And then the fourth image that she looks at is the image of Saddam Hussein's statue being torn down in Baghdad. And just she doesn't talk about this, but just as an interesting kind of connection to make, it makes me think about the reading from several weeks ago by Joan Marie Johnson about Confederate memorials and the broader, right, conflicts going on in this country about Confederate memorials, and how much outrage there is about statues of various Confederate heroes being pulled down, whereas in this case, right, the pulling down of the statue of Saddam Hussein, who had been this sort of dictator of Iraq, was celebrated by the U.S. military. So in that case, the tearing down of the statue was seen as a righteous act, where in many cases the tearing down of statues here in this country is seen as a sort of unacceptable act. Just something to think about. But back to McAlister's chapter. So she uses this image to talk about how during the Iraq War there was really an unprecedented level of military control of media coverage. So that while this image was sort of broadcast on television as an act in which Iraqi civilians who were, thrilled that the U.S. military had come in to free them from the dictator Saddam Hussein and sort of spontaneously tore the statue down. In fact, that's not what happened. In fact, it was U.S. Military personnel who decided that the statue should come down, and then they kind of encouraged Iraqi civilians to crowd around it so that they could, create these images that made it look right, like the civilians were spontaneously celebrating being sort of liberated by the U.S. military. And so there's a whole branch, actually, of the U.S. military called psychological operations, which is basically the propaganda wing. And so that's what this was, right? This was carefully orchestrated propaganda to present the war, right, in the most positive light as possible to the American public. And in addition, she talks about the role of embedded reporters, which was sort of a new thing in the Iraq War, where journalists from various news organizations were actually embedded within U.S. military units. They would go through basic training with them and whatnot. The idea being that they could get, a first-hand view of the conflict, but also that meant that they had a somewhat biased view of the conflict, right, from the perspective of the U.S. military, and there were constraints on what they could and could not cover. The most kind of specific one that McAlister points out is that the journalists were not allowed to cover American casualties, right? They weren't allowed to film, photograph, broadcast the hundreds, if not thousands, of U.S. military personnel who were dying in this conflict. Because again, right, the military was trying to really control the image that Americans back home saw of this war. And then the fifth image that McAlister looks at is of a prisoner at Abu Ghraib. And she compares this photograph to photographs of lynchings of African Americans in the American South, and the idea that the sort of dehumanization and torture of a person would be put on display as something to be sort of proud of, which unfortunately did happen for many decades in the early 20th century here in this country, and that this image of, right, the tortured prisoners in Abu Ghraib was sort of a 21st century version of that same kind of phenomenon. And so she talks about this as sort of the racialization of religion, right? So that Muslims become seen as the sort of other innately evil race of people who therefore are somehow deserving, right, of torture and humiliation. And, the big controversy about the treatment of prisoners in this context, which is still going on, is that all sorts of methods of torture which have been banned by international law, and that the United States has, in principle agreed to these international laws, were allowed to be carried out in the name of national security. And so these are not people who have necessarily been found guilty of any sort of crime, right? These are people who are just sort of suspected of being involved in terrorism, in many cases purely based on how they look or their name or who they know. This was happening in the United States as well as abroad. And so not that it would ever be okay to treat anyone in these ways, but this is really, that's why she talks about it in the context of race, right, and racism, because it really is this understanding that just because you're Muslim or even brown-skinned, right, that you are somehow subhuman and deserving of this sort of torture. And interestingly, she does argue that in contrast to this dynamic of lynching in the American South, that this newer sort of 21st century version is a little different, because it's not necessarily sort of Muslims versus whites or white America, but that it's more sort of Muslims versus the sort of multicultural America, right? So you have soldiers who are black and white and brown and Native American, potentially Latinx, who are all participating in this to varying degrees, and are all sort of seeing themselves as the sort of righteous source of freedom and democracy in the world. And that the multiculturalism of America is seen as a sort of icon of, right, freedom and democracy, as opposed to the sort of more homogenous kind of societies in the Middle East. And so it's a similar phenomenon, but the racial dynamics are a little different, and there's, more of a religious, more prominent kind of religious aspect to it. So, McAlister argues that all of these images represented America and Americans as a place of freedom and safety, in opposition to the Middle East and Muslims in particular as a sort of unfree and dangerous. And she shows how race and gender and sexuality and class and, of course, religion were central to how these images were produced and consumed. So I hope that you enjoyed this cultural studies and media studies approach to American studies scholarship, and that it provokes you to think more about how the images we see on TV and in social media produce certain ideas about America that are often oriented towards particular foreign policy goals. Right? These are not, just because something's a photograph or a video, right, does not mean it's representing sort of the truth in some objective sense, right? It's an image that's being produced by certain people for certain purposes. So, as usual, your reflections and discussion board posts are due Sunday at midnight, and I will not see you next week. But please reach out as you are thinking about your final reflection if you have any questions. It really has been a difficult but fun experiment for me to teach this class this way. I do regret that I have not been able to interact with all of you. I'm sure you have had a lot of thoughtful questions and ideas about the material that were not included in your reflections. But I hope that through the lectures and the readings you have learned something about yourself and this country and our place in the world. I hope you have gotten a better idea of how scholars approach studying America through both intersectional and transnational lenses, and that you are now more comfortable and inclined to think about the world around you in intersectional and transnational ways. So never again will you think about an issue as just about race or just about gender or just about America and not any of its neighboring countries. And honestly, even if one of these readings and concepts has challenged or expanded your idea of America or Americans, I will consider the class a success. So thank you all for your time and attention. And please keep in touch if there is anything I can do to support you on your continued academic and professional journeys.